And we'll start the session. Okay, good afternoon. My name is Mark McFadden. I'm with Interconnect Communications. I'm a internet infrastructure consultant based in Wales in the United Kingdom. Next to me on the right is Bobby Flame from the FBI in the United States. Next to me on the left is Emily Taylor, a internet governance consultant based in Oxford, England. And next to her is Patrick Falstrom, who I've learned in the last session we have to allow him to introduce himself. He's in charge of, let me see if I can do it now, he's in charge of research and development at NAT. He holds many other hats, as we've learned, but most importantly to me anyway, he's the chair of the Security and Stability Advisory Committee in ICANN, as well as a routine participant in the ITF. Your panel is also joined by Jeff Houston remotely. Jeff is on assignment, I think, in Hong Kong. He'll tell me if I'm wrong. He routinely does that. And I often am. And so this is IGF 2014's workshop number 100. It's a workshop on carrier-grade network address translation. And my goal here, and the goal of the workshop when we proposed it to the IGF, was to raise awareness in the capacity building program of this IGF to talk about what the impacts were on the network, and Jeff and Patrick will talk about that. Talk about what the impact is on law enforcement and cybercrime. We're lucky to have Bobby here to talk about that. And then what happens in the legal environment, and Emily will talk about that. If we have time, one of the things we'll be talking about is unexpected impacts on users. I think that's one of the most intriguing parts of the implications of carrier-grade network address translation technologies. The approach I'm going to take in this workshop has actually changed since I last edited it on the website. And what we're going to do is do a couple of the presentations and then start the process of opening up to questions, comments, and potential rants. Perhaps potential is the wrong word, near certain rants. So let me start by, and looking around the room, there are so many people in the room who do not need an introduction to this topic, but as I've prepared the slides, I feel compelled to take you through a couple of them at least, to make sure that everyone understands what this technology is and how it works before we talk about the implications. And let me see if this works. I'm sure I'm doing this wrong. I think this one? So I will say, before I start here, I was in a session previously that was on the issue of accountability. And one of the things that I reflected on as I sat through that session was how people described their understanding of how the internet works. And I would like to propose a thought to you, is that someone in your life sat you down with a soda, a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, 2 or 3 glasses of beer, and tried to explain to you how the internet works. I can assure you that whatever you think, it's wrong. There are a handful of people who actually really know how the internet works, and every time, it's like peeling back an onion. The network dynamics and the architecture are complex and very different from what we think of when we think of the old style end-to-end communications between very intelligent endpoints across a stupid network. That was your grandfather's internet, and your grandfather only uses the internet now. He doesn't architect it. The new internet is much, much different. And an important part of that is something that many of us are used to in small businesses, big businesses, at our homes, at our offices. And that is a technology called network address translation. And it's simply a matter of doing this, is that at an endpoint, and here we have on a slide a picture of this, we have a box that does a task of having a public-facing internet protocol address that represents multiple private addresses behind a network address translation device. And that network address translation device usually has multiple functions, but one of its most important is to conserve public IP addresses. And it does this by doing a translation function. People using, for instance, at your house, people using a network inside of a house would use private address space that can be reused in other locations, other offices, other homes, and so forth. And the NAT box, or the network address translation box, is responsible for doing translations from the private address space into the public address space. This is a technology that's been with us since the 90s. It's been a part of broadband implementations since the early 2000s. It has been with us a long time. It is extremely well understood technology. It has caused us problems, but largely problems that we have solved over the years, both engineering problems, content problems, security problems, and so forth. All of those largely solved. A well understood, very mature technology. Now, carrier-grade NAT, and I apologize for using the acronym here, but you'll catch me drifting and using CGN as a way to shorten up the presentation, places a second layer of network address translation in the access network. The idea here is, in an era where we're short of IPv4 public addresses, one of the things that's possible is to actually extend the concept of NAT and put it into the network, making network address translation actually take place, not just in your home, not just in your office, but actually in the ISP, the provider's network. That means that as packets are sent from one end of the network to another, as they go through these CGNs, they're modified twice, once at the ISP and another time at the boundary of the consumer's network, whether that's a business or a home, a residence, and so forth. Regrettably, one of the things that it does is it moves the public IPv4 address, and you'll hear a lot about this in the next hour, from the user's device, the device that's in their house, in their office, at their location, right, or the one that is shared in a larger business, into the network itself. And that's going to have significant impacts, as we'll see. There are law enforcement impacts, there are network impacts, there are also legal impacts. Now here's a look at the picture that you saw before, now just modified with having a second NAT put in place. You have on the right-hand side of the pictures the customer NATs, the ones that we're all so familiar with, but they connect back to a carrier-grade NAT that is in the provider's network. And so the network address translation takes place twice. The impact of that is one of the things that we want to explore this afternoon. Here's another look, just with more words. This is what things looked like in the early 1990s and the 1980s before we had NATs at all. Now you'll see the diagram gets slightly more complex when we actually put NATs at consumer devices, this time confusingly on the left-hand side of the picture. And then finally, in the environment that we find ourselves in, where we're starting to see the implementation of carrier-grade NATs, two sets of translations, and you see the dashed lines in the middle of the diagram there. Now, what is the motivation for actually doing this? One of the things that many of you know is that we're at a point at which we're running out of IPv4 addresses. And I worked for what was formerly a dominant ISP in a country, harking back to another presentation. And one of the things that some large ISPs have a problem with is inward investment to try to take advantage of new technologies without obvious customer bases. And so what some ISPs want to do is actually extend the lifetime of their existing public IPv4 address space as they manage the transition to IPv6. Our company did some research and some interviews with ISPs, and these two words were commonly used as a motivation for carrier-grade NATs, is that they gave them time. And the words we heard several times, in fact, was that it provided breathing space for large ISPs to manage their transitions to IPv6. It allows them to support truly traditional users under traditional circumstances with the NAT box that we've known, again, since the 1990s. And it allows ISPs that are under pressure to support additional broadband development of their business to support growth while not having to go out and find new IPv4 addresses. Now, almost every ISP we talked to, remarkably, said that they did not feel that carrier-grade NATs were a replacement for IPv6. Most of the interviewees that we did in our study said that what they wanted to have was some breathing space, an assistive technology that allowed them to get out of the predicament that they found themselves in and gain some time so that they could do the investment they needed to move to IPv6. Now, the people who appear to be using IPv6, and I'll say more about this in a moment, are people who are not in a position to move quickly to IPv6. So, I'm sorry, let me back up here. The people who are most likely to use CGNs are the people who are having trouble with the transition to IPv6, especially ISPs who find themselves in a situation where they don't have a pool of available public IPv4 address space. Now, CGN changes some very fundamental things. And on the screen, the most important thing is these two small bullets, is that in traditional networking, for instance, my father's internet, One of the things that we had was a NAT box at our premises, whether it was a business or a residence, and we got a public address for that box, and then that box translated on behalf of the boxes behind it in some topological sense. They translated it into private address space. Now that has changed. In fact, and this is a very important point, consumers share their IPv4 addresses with others. That means that you and I and many others actually share a common public IPv4 address under this architecture. So that address sharing is fundamental to the changes and challenges, and I'll say a couple more words about it here because it is really one of the fundamental points that causes the problems that Bobby, Jeff, Patrick, and Emily are going to talk about. And that is this address sharing has significant impacts on the way that we do things, on the protocols that we know and love on the public internet. Here's an example, and this is my favorite example that's not related to law enforcement. Imagine that an ISP shares a single address among 5,000 customers, and that a banking site has a policy that if someone does fraud, what they do is they block that IP address that's identified for the fraud. The moment that they've blocked that IP address, they've blocked 5,000 customers. One bad actor under this scenario has the effect of taking 4,999 other customers down with them. That's a significant problem. And that's a great example of what one of the problems is with address sharing. Now, this is my disclaimer slide. One of the things that you should know is that carrier-grade NATs have been used in mobile networks for many years, for a very, very long time. And that's because the environment in mobile networks is much, much different than traditional consumer broadband networks. For instance, there are very few inbound connections to your mobile device. That doesn't happen very much. You usually don't have a media server running on your phone. And new applications in the home do depend on inbound connections. So there's a real difference there. Mobile networks generally have very, very tight connections of their end devices. And so in home networks, we don't see that. In fact, there's great challenges in terms of the kinds of devices that are in play in, for instance, a home or a business network. So mobile networks are very, very different. Now, the implications of CGM on users are significant. You can no longer use the IP address to identify a specific customer, and Bobby will talk about that in a moment and what that means. It has legal implications, and Emily will talk about that. Any service that relies on an IP address to identify a customer or service is broken immediately. There's no hope for it. And a lot of basic internet services like to have a one-to-one correspondence between users and addresses, and now that's broken as well. Now, there's also something called geolocation. One of the things that many people like to do is be able to take their mobile device or their laptop, take it from place to place, and the device can discover, often by using the IP address, where it is in the world. That's broken. And I'm going to sound like a broken record here. There's also a real problem with inbound connections, and if we have time at the end today, I'll tell you a story about the Sony PlayStation. And that is, the short story of the Sony PlayStation is when it's actually looking to play, when you're looking to play games with someone, you can't find someone who's sharing the same IP address as you. If you can't actually find, and they're sharing 5,000 addresses, or 5,000 consumers are sharing a single address, then the problem is that that's 5,000 possible people that you could be playing a game with that are no longer available to you. So there are huge implications on users for this technology. Now you'd say to me, well, that was a lot of bad news in one slide, and indeed it is. But one of the things you could ask me is then why would ISPs bother with this? Because there's obviously going to be support costs, there are obviously going to be real problems. It turns out that many basic internet services and applications work. Things like email, things like basic web browsing work just fine. For instance, my 83-year-old mother just uses email and browses the web most of the time. And most of the time, a CGN connection would work for her. Client applications usually work. Now, peer-to-peer ones are a problem, but client applications often work. And services that don't depend on a connection between the subscriber and the IP address, those work as well. So a basic internet user is often not affected here. But what we found is that in the growing community of internet users, the basic internet users are becoming more and more of a minority. And so the success of deploying CGNs is how it's deployed and configured for whom. Now, we've already talked about this, and I'm going to move past it, because one of the things that's going to happen here is that I'm going to let Jeff and Patrick talk about the architectural implications of this and what it means to the internet in general. I'm going to let Bobby talk about what this means in terms of breakage for law enforcement. I'm going to talk and let Emily talk very interestingly about the things that happen in the legal environment here. But the things break primarily because of this address sharing and the things that are required to support the address sharing. Now, the three things that ISPs face when they implement CGNs that we found in our surveys is they find an increase in their requirements for logging, support calls get greater, we actually can document that, and they have troubleshooting. They have problems troubleshooting connectivity issues. And so what happens is, and we have this story from one ISP that's in Europe, is that they've implemented CGNs, and if a customer calls to complain about the service they're getting that CGN, the help desk will simply move them to a traditional circuit and claim the problem is solved. Well, it might be, but there's no way to know. Now, I'll skip through this. Logging is a huge problem because one of the things that happens is that we use something else in the internet protocol to capture the unique identity and allow the network address translation to take place, and those are called port identifiers. Too technical for our talk today, but one of the implications for ISPs is the cost of logging. I also mentioned that every ISP that's implemented CGNs has told us, at least in interviews, that their support costs actually go up. And so we have documents for that. And now what I'd like to do, and if I could ask the person who's helping me here and move to the presentation that we have one slide for, and then see if we can get Jeff in a situation where he can have the mic. I'm going to introduce Jeff Houston, who's not with us, but is definitely with us in spirit. And Jeff, I think your mic is on. What I've done, Jeff, is I've put some links on the screen. Because Jeff's not doing a remote presentation, we talked about whether or not to go through slides with him. And that's difficult to do in a remote presentation. But I wanted to make sure that you had the resources. And the third link, working from the bottom here, the third link is a presentation given, I remember it as in January, but apparently in March of this year, that would have been very close to the slides that Jeff would have presented had he been here. The second one up is a slightly geekier one on network forensics. That is, how do you discover things in the presence of CGN? How does CGN actually make things more difficult to discover connectivity problems, problems in the chain of routing, for instance, and so forth. And then finally, an interesting presentation that is also fairly geeky that came from, I remember it as the winter of last year, I guess it is the winter of last year, on some other issues related to carrier-grade NATs. And so now here's our test. Jeff, can you hear me?
Certainly, Mark, I can hear you, and the real question is, can you hear me?
Well, great. May I pass it to you and let you add what I'm hoping you'll do is just take a short minute to introduce yourself as Chief Scientist at APNIC, and then talk a little bit about your interest in architectural issues and your feeling about the implications for CGNs on architecture.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, and again, my apologies for not being able to make it to Istanbul. Other things have called me away, including the Hong Kong Network Operators Group. But look, I'm pleased to be here in what is in the middle of the night for me, and pleased to give you a quick introduction to my perspective on this. I come from one of the regional internet registries, and I'm the Chief Scientist at APNIC, the Asia Pacific Regional Internet Registry. We're one of the group of folk that I suppose you could say we're part of the problem here, because we've run out of V4 addresses. We ran out of them back in April of 2011. If you're in the Asia-Pacific area, you're an ISP, you're a service provider, you wish to expand your business, knock on our door, can I have addresses? No. We can give you a very small amount, 1,000, no more. Oddly enough, we're not unique in this situation. The RIPE NCC in Europe ran out in September 2012. More recently, LACNIC in South America and the Caribbean has run out of V4 addresses in May of this year. So we're running on empty. We knew this a long time ago. And the use of NATs, at least at the consumer level, has been very prevalent. We estimate around 90% of the internet is behind one level of NAT. But what we're now finding is that the use of carrier-grade NATs is becoming increasingly obvious. In our latest set of measurements, we've found that more than 5% of the internet's client base, there's 2.3 billion people, 5% of them will change their IP address within 10 seconds. They'll simply flip to use a new address. Now, that's a lot of folk, and if the real issue is NATs are horrible, don't do this, then we're too late. We're well past the point of trying to say stop. So in some sense, criticising NATs and saying they're bad is like criticising reality and saying reality's bad. To some extent, we've got to get used to it. But we're finding it really difficult because a lot of the mindset of the internet was actually borrowed from the mindset of telephony. And we like to view the internet more as a network that shares a lot with a telephone legacy. In the telephone network, every handset has a phone number. And that association of a physical location, a subscriber, a person, and a phone number is very stable and very long-lived. Telephone numbers identify endpoints. And so the network becomes a point where if you can find what telephone numbers are doing, you can establish what users are doing. We used to run the internet like that, but then we started to deploy NATs. The implications of NATs are quite subtle. They first divided the world into clients and servers. Servers have stable IP addresses. They're web servers, mail servers, and so on. But you and I are clients. We now borrow an address for a conversation. And our computers might have multiple conversations, and oddly enough, they might have multiple addresses at the same time. And that same public address can be used by many of us clients also at the same time. The network doesn't know who we are anymore. The network can't tell the difference between me and Mark and Patrick or anyone else. That's a really big architectural shift. All of a sudden now, addresses aren't endpoint identification tokens. They're not stable. They're not long-lived. The best they are is an ephemeral, non-unique conversation token with no lasting significance. Architecturally, we've taken the concept of a phone number and ripped it apart. What does that mean? Well, as you'll hear from Bobby, the whole issue around forensics and gathering data records from the network doesn't work in a NAT world. Because all of a sudden, the addresses you get from the packet headers make no sense anymore. Their significance is not personally identifying information. If you're lucky, it's national identifying information, and at worst, it's probably continental. It certainly doesn't identify you or me or anyone else. And even a day or even a minute after the event, someone else is using that address, or a very large number of people. So data retention becomes questionable. And what we're compelling ISPs to do in retaining all that data is simply collecting a garbage bag full of bits, just ones and zeros, without any significance. The problems also come in applications, because from the perspective of an application designer, the network is now untrustable. Applications are forced to use their own approaches for persistent endpoint identity and hide those approaches from the network. Applications are now submarine. Tor and Skype are examples of where we're heading as exemplars rather than one-off aberrations. What we're finding now is instead of using what supports, applications use internal TCP muxing. They use, in effect, encryption on the fly continuously, because what they want to do is hide their true behavior and masquerade into something that looks like it's NAT friendly. So now we're finding application behavior becoming increasingly fragile, that the network itself is no longer as robust as it used to be, and it's no longer as open as it used to be. Now, in theory, all this is going to come to an end because we're all going to be running D6. And at that magic day, you know, all these NATs are just going to be dismantled, in theory. But as the years progress and as D6 adoption doesn't, we don't really have a clear idea of how we get to that magical point. What we do know is this transition is taking an awfully long time, and the network grows at a continuing huge rate. And the only way that we can absorb that growth is not by fielding extra V4 addresses, because we haven't got any. The only way we can do that is to fuel NATs that get more and more complex. So port sharing NATs, yeah, yesterday's news. I think we've now got to look towards subtle NATs that are called 5-tuple NATs that manage to squeeze a few thousand customers behind one single address, and do so by multiplexing the same address and port numbers across different connections in order to squeeze the maximal amount of value out of each address. At this point, you can truly say the network has no clue about what you and I are doing. And even applications are finding it difficult to be robust and work well inside such a complex environment. I think, you know, with those references to the more detailed packs, I've probably said as much as I can inside this context, Mark, so I will hand the microphone back to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and I appreciate your staying up. And if you can bear with us, I'd have you stay on the line for just a bit longer. I'm going to
Sure.
put Patrick on the spot here, partly because his experience in the standards community, both of you are very active in the standards community, but also from his point of view in terms of network architecture and what the evolution of carrier-grade NATs means from his perspective. Can I do that, Patrick?
Thank you, Mark. I was looking at your slides and arguments on why people use carrier-grade NATs, and just like people think that normal NAT is a security device, people think that carrier-grade NAT is solving all different kind of problems, including, I don't know, starvation, lack of water, too much water, and other kind of hurricane, earthquake, natural disaster things. So I think to be able to understand and talk about NAT, we need to sort of try to untangle what various features we have there. So if I take one of the examples that you had, you said mobile operators, they run out of IP addresses. Okay. If we look at communication over the internet, we have to remember that what IP addresses are used for is not only to identify the other endpoint. We actually have a 5-tuple, 5 different numbers, which together must create for the, at the moment, unique combination that identifies a flow or a communication. And out of those 5 numbers, 2 of them are IP addresses of the endpoints that communicate. 2 of them are the protocols, and the 5th one is what protocol it is, TCP, UDP, etc. This means that when we look at the core of the internet, and I must point out that I don't really like your picture, Mark, because you had the internet over there and then sort of NatBox and stuff like outside of the internet. I'm sorry, all of that is actually part of the internet, so make new slides. Anyways, well, you wanted to have comments. So if we take a mobile operator that run out of addresses for their end users, and they add a NAT, that implies that what they want to do is that they would like to reuse IP addresses and have fewer IP addresses on their upstream side than downstream side, because if they have multiple clients, they will, okay. Unfortunately, for the ISP or for the cell phone provider, people like to have their phone connected all the time, and they like to be connected to Facebook all the time. And there are at least 3 different cell phone providers that I have helped that started to go down the path of carrier-grade NAT, and they understood that, wait a second, this is actually not a good thing at all. They had to move from having 9 customers per IP address, because people use their phones so sparsely, so they checked their Facebook and then didn't do anything. Wait a little bit, and then they started to use it again. So that they could have 9 customers per IP address. Just 3 years later, they could only have 1.1 customer per IP address, okay? Which means that all their customers were using their cell phone all the time. Now, on the upstream side of a NAT, you are supposed to share the IP address in the 5-tuple across several users downstream. If we have a one-to-one mapping between the IP addresses, then the only thing you can sort of share are the port numbers, because you still need a unique sort of combination upstream. In the IP protocol, we only have 65,000 ports per IP address. And if you use Google Maps, or if you look at your laptop or phone or whatever you use, like there's basically no difference between these two, you see that each computer nowadays easily have 200 connections up at the same time. This means that if we have one-to-one mapping between the IP addresses, we can only have 65,000 divided by 300 customers per IP address upstream. If you now calculate, which is not so much, if you now look at the cost for a CGN box, that business calculation for the telco to remove the NAT and give public IP addresses to the end users and only implement firewalls for security reasons was a piece of cake, okay? So there are no technical reasons to use carrier-grade NAT, except then maybe in the cases that you really run out, you deploy IPv6 for your cell phone customers, blah, 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 except business reasons, they want to keep control. So in reality, what people want to do, what they think they want to do, is to keep control. And this is back to what Jeff was talking about. I think you mentioned this slide as well, that too many people that build business models think about the old days. They have old telco thinking. And to some degree, of course, the customers are asking for it. Because the customers, whenever something doesn't work, what do people do? They either call the company which name it is on the phone itself, Nokia or Apple or like whatever it is, or they call their ISP or cell phone provider, regardless of why there is a problem. So yes, to some degree, there is some control that the provider would like to have, but the answer is not NAT. The answer might be to have a box that could filter the traffic, that makes sure that you don't get download service attacks downstream, that makes sure that, because you don't really want to run SMB protocol on these things globally anyways, so they can filter out some of the protocols, yada, 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 all those kind of things. But that's not a NAT, and that's not IP address sharing. The second thing that you were talking about had to do with, you mentioned, oh, there are so many applications and services that take for granted that you only have one customer, one user per IP address, and that the end user have the same IP address all the time, et cetera, et cetera. Those are false assumptions. Those were true like many, many years ago. There are people that believe that you need to have, if you run a web server, you must have a unique IP address per web host if you run TLS. No, that was true up until 2003, okay? People that today claim that you need to have unique IP addresses because you want to run HTTPS, they're sort of 11 years behind, okay? So even on the internet side, there is so much more that can be done to make software and services stable regarding quick changes of IP addresses, which for reasons that Jeff explained, that we have multiple addresses today, that will still happen. That has nothing to do with NAT. So there are certain things that NAT implies that we would have anyways, and that is bad design on the application side. I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Patrick. What I intended to do now is to open the floor to the workshop here. I have quite a little collect for 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It's a pretty good collection of people, although I was saying we didn't get gender balance right. But maybe that's the selection of topic more than anything else. But I'd like... What I'd like to do is open the floor to any comments, any questions. Jeff, I think, is still with us. Patrick is here, and talk about the architectural issues that have been brought up, and any questions or comments that anyone has. Or you? Could you say who you are and who you work with?
Sure. My name is Maria Farrell, and I work at Internet Connect. Oh God, I cannot remember. Interconnect Communications, and Mark McFadden is my boss. If I were a privacy advocate and I were listening to all of this stuff about how hard it is to track people, how hard it is to do geolocation, how hard it is, etc., I would think this sounds fabulous. So I'm sure there must be a downside. What is it? Apart from all of the many downsides that you've presented already, but for those of us worried about privacy, you know, what's bad about this picture?
Could I offer a couple of comments here, Mark?
Yeah, please do, Jeff.
From the point of view of someone looking from the outside, a law enforcement agency or similar, putting the pieces together, a web log, a transaction log from the ISP, some retained data logs, NATs and carrier-grade NATs make that task remarkably difficult because, of course, where you collect the data alters the data you're looking at because the addresses change depending on where you are in the network. But oddly enough, there is one operator that gets a uniquely detailed view because they happen to know who the user is and they happen to know where they're going to. And that's, oddly enough, the operator of that carrier-grade NAT. Everything you do, every ad, every click, everything that happens on your device happens through that carrier-grade NAT. And if you are that network operator in real time, you can actually put the pieces together for yourself. But third parties find it difficult. So, you know, it advantages some folk, but other folk find it a lot tougher. And that's the kind of weird outcome we get from that situation. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Emily.
I would just agree with what Jeff said. And as somebody who's interested in privacy myself, when I first started looking at this, I was very much like, yay, this sounds good. Except, as Jeff says, it's who knows. And instead of people who, you know, in certain situations, you actually might want to know, like law enforcement not in every situation, but in certain situations, like fighting crime, you would actually want that data to be available to them. Instead, it is the omniscience of the network provider, and it promotes them in the pecking order and the hierarchy of, you know, if knowledge is power, then they're right up there. And it really changes the sort of complexion of what they do and the trust and the trustworthiness that they need to have. And I don't know about you, but my levels of trust in network operator, well, in pretty much everybody to do with the internet has been pretty shaken in the last few years. And I'm not at all comfortable with that situation.
I think Maria here touches on the core concept and hooking up to what you said in your introduction. To the basic internet user, NATs are wonderful. The traditional net, everybody sees that as a firewall. This essentially is a huge marketing problem because to the average user, oh, this is this wonderful feature, this is this wonderful device. And unfortunately, what people lack is the awareness to know what they're missing because this is so widespread. People don't care, and I think that's and looking around the room, I unfortunately see a really lot of familiar faces and not that many people who I think are really new to the problem. And what we really need, I think, is also here for civil society to think one step further. Like you said in your introduction, Mark, the basic internet user is becoming a minority, and looking way forward with machine to machine, the Internet of Things, and what it comes down to is maintaining the openness and maintaining the freedom to innovate, and this is what we're breaking and making people aware of that problem that can hopefully turn away from, oh, NAT is a wonderful thing, because really they aren't.
Go ahead, Patrick.
What is bad product marketing for one party is good product marketing for another one. And so we have to remember that there are forces that absolutely think this is a good thing. We have since, in the mid-1980s, we came up with this sort of idea to start with competition, and we started with sort of private-led innovation regarding telecommunication, and that has sort of led to the internet that we have today, that we can do whatever we want at the edges, we can connect whatever we can. I think in 1989 and 88, when I wanted a phone, I had to go to the telco, ask for a phone, and maybe I can go there and actually get a phone in one of maybe 3 colors. Woohoo! They released about 2 services a year, and the most advanced one was like star 21, star phone number square. How many new services do we have on the internet every year today? A few more than 2, right? So what has now happened, the reason for that is that we have moved the ability to we have created an environment, both political, because this is a good thing for the society, technical, and like that we all like. The ability to innovate at the edge. And that means that the core of the network has lost control, and obviously this was a good thing. What is happening with carrier-grade NAT is that we are moving back the control, just like we heard, and as Jeff said, it's not at all the case that we get higher privacy by hiding behind a NAT. It's the other way around, because you cannot choose what carrier-grade NAT you have, only by starting your own ISP or that you have your own carrier-grade NAT at, or move to another ISP. For me, privacy is choice and transparency. That's where you have, that's how you attack the privacy issues, not by completely trusting a single party that has the CGN that knows everything what you're doing.
Okay, good. Other thoughts? Sure.
Just small note. Actually, the number of IPv4 addresses is still decreasing, and in the most cases, CGN is the choice made due to this reason, you know. That's obvious, and you told about that. And yeah, right now it may be cheaper to buy just public addresses and give public addresses to the clients and do not have all this mess with the CGNet. That's right. Tomorrow probably CGNet can be cheaper because the price of IPv4 will increase. But what I would say that what we are doing here, we are trying to postpone IPv6 actually. We are trying to, and IPv6 is not a magic. IPv6 actually, to be honest, it's full body of problem. Unknown problems, you know, we don't know those problems yet. And trying to postpone it means that we want to know them at once, all problems at once. That's not wise, actually. It's reasonable to start IPv6 right now to understand what's going on, what we have there, and this is very important for industry at whole, I mean. So I think that it's very important idea to understand that it's necessary to do something else except with CGNet, even if you're out of IPv4. That's it.
Other thoughts or questions about infrastructure? Let me go here, and then I'll go to Michele.
Hi, I'm Nicola Reis, and I'm maybe more of a layman than most people around the room. So listening to this presentation, I'm starting to think that who in their right mind would put this in place? And we've heard that there are economic reasons. So given that we have concerns over the security aspects, over the market access, over the privacy aspects, that's enough reasons to stop this. My question is, how common are CGNs today in the architecture? Is this something that is so common that we require panels like this, or are we more worried about the transition coming up to IPv6, where they will become more common?
Well, Jeff, should you or I take the how common is it problem? Oh, we got to give you a microphone. Here you go. You're on.
Thank very much. We guess right now that almost half of today's internet live behind carrier-grade NATs. It's not such a bad guess because that's based on the observation that in the mobile services market, carrier-grade NATs are the norm and not the exception. So for almost every kind of device that runs on batteries and uses radio, it's going to be behind a carrier-grade NAT most of the time, the small number of exceptions. What we are seeing recently in the wired network, however, is carrier-grade NAT appearing there. It's more prevalent in the developing economies. So, for example, if you live in Ethiopia, it is around a 50% chance that you are behind a carrier-grade NAT, and we observe the address changes happening inside 10 seconds. So for many of those economies, carrier-grade NAT is very prevalent. It is less prevalent in the wired networks in the more developed economies, and my guess is of the total internet population of the wired network, not wireless, carrier-grade NATs cover at this point between 10 and 15% of that population, but it's rising. That's my estimates, Mark.
Well, I'll just add a data point to that, Jeff. In 2012, when we did our survey of UK-based ISPs, we found that if you measured the number of ISPs that are either implementing or doing testbed implementations of carrier-grade NAT, you got to nearly 90% of the ISPs in the UK. So it definitely is. It is something. Now that doesn't tell you about how many of those have actually moved to implementation, and I don't have statistics about that from the survey that we did a year ago, but what you see is that there's a great deal of research going on. I have Michaeli and then this gentleman.
Thanks, Michaela Nayland. Oh God, he's grinning at me. That makes me nervous. I mean, this entire thing around carrier-grade NAT, the IPv4 exhaustion and the total lack of take-up of IPv6, it's a timely discussion for those of us on my side of the business. I mean, we're a hosting provider, we're a domain name registrar. Whilst I'm sitting in this session, I'm also discussing with my business partner how on earth we're going to acquire more IPv4 address space. Rates were being quoted now. I mean, I'm sure there's other people in the room will have other numbers varying from $5 or $6 per IP address and upwards. That's a significant cost. It also has a significant impact on businesses' ability to develop, grow, innovate, be that on the edge or anywhere else. If, for example, we as a company end up being limited in our growth because we've simply run out of IPv4 address space, then that's really pathetic. Now, the carrier-grade NAT tests and all that are all well and good and fascinating, and the limitations and issues there, a lot of us know about. The flip side to that is that most of the ISPs that I've dealt with have conducted trials and tests on IPv6. But only a tiny percentage of them have actually moved into any form of production. For those of you who aren't familiar with me and can't tell from my accent, I'm Irish. In Ireland, I know, it's shocking. In Ireland at present, none of what we would consider to be the mainstream ISPs, the ones that are doing the bulk of the business, offer IPv6. They are all technically capable of doing it. They have all tested it. They have all tested it further and backwards and forwards and inside out. They have all been asked repeatedly when they will deploy IPv6, and none of them have done anything about it. So the question I would ask to the government types in the room is, would you please, please, please provide an incentive to the private sector, in other words, the bloody ISPs, to turn on IPv6, and the simplest way for you to do that is to actually include an IPv6 requirement or score in your public tenders. If you did that, there would be they would start paying attention. Thanks.
Let me, I promise I'll come to you, but Bobby, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to answer that question. Excellent point, and I was going to bring this up in my my presentation. But I'm the co-chair of the U.S. government IPv6 task force, and one of the things that we require is the public tenders or procurement, where we require that all the services and all the equipment that is bought is supposed to be IPv6 capable and enabled. A lot of the problems that we're facing is in the implementation, insofar as the procurement people don't know enough about the tech requirements, so they're not actually demanding it and asking it. There's one very big cloud provider that I recently spoke to, and I said, you know, you're not doing IPv6, why isn't it? And they said, well, we are going to start doing it now, because one of the very big ISP providers who's very pro IPv6 and in talk and in action is going to now require that from Amazon, you know, it being IPv6, so that's when they're going to start doing it. I was like, well, what about the U.S. government asking that? Well, and they said, you don't bring us enough business to make us change our business plans. But your point is well taken, and it's excellent. It's all about the money, because IPv6 is about a tech refresh, and it's about buying routers, it's about buying equipment, it's about buying everything that's IPv6, and it costs money. So if a lot of these companies, the ISPs, whoever, can hold on to the last threads of whatever they're having, that's what they're going to do. And now, another thing that's happening is there's a big market from the vendors who actually make CGNs. And once all these ISPs put all their money, millions, sometimes tens of millions of dollars in CGN equipment, it's not going to disappear overnight. And that's a huge problem, and we need to create a huge disincentive to building more CGN equipment, because the more they spend, the less likely it is it's going to disappear.
That's exactly right. I'm going to sneak Emily in here, and then I have a gentleman waiting here, and then one over there, and then I'm going to close the queue.
Hi. Very quickly, Michele, yeah, excellent points, and I think from the other side of the Irish Sea, it's a pretty woeful situation in terms of IPv6 adoption, and the study that Mark and I and others from Interconnect did a year or so before we did this one was on answering the question, why is the UK so rubbish at IPv6? And we looked around the whole world and tried to figure out what were the success factors. And to our surprise, we found, and I was very interested that you invoked the government in the last comments, that the countries that were doing well had one thing in common, and that was that their governments got right behind it, not just in incentivizing, but as you say, in their tendering, deploying themselves. But the fundamental elephant in the room is that deploying IPv6 is expensive and difficult. And so why wouldn't you put off that evil hour if nobody's going to do anything about it? And the evidence is that nobody is going to do anything about it.
Okay, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. I apologize for that.
No problem, because now it's quite interesting to answer for me, because I've been in both roles. I've been an ISP since '95, and the last 4 years I was member of the German Parliament dealing with all the internet issues. And we had a special working group dealing with internet and digital society, and a subgroup concerning addressing the issue IPv6 and also carrier grade NAT. And we've been discussing over half a year both sides. One is more privacy, on the other hand, well, how do we get rid of IPv4? And if we introduce IPv6, everyone has a personal address as personal, addressable, and there's no anonymity there. So, but we've been, well, discussing a theoretical technical idea that, well, with IPv6, both is possible, because you can have as much addresses as you like. Half of them fixed for special services where you want fixed addresses, another netted where you want netted addresses. So it might be possible to have advantages from both sides with IPv6. It's technically, of course, a huge challenge to do so, I know, but it's possible.
Thank you. Let me go over here.
Hello, thank you. Martin Levy with Cloudflare. V6. let's talk about some things that the end users don't see and put a bit of a positive spin on this. There are carriers out there that when they have enabled V6, for all the problems that they go through to do that, but when they do, they find that traffic flows, that end users get data, and more importantly, on an absolute majority, because this is a requirement, the end users don't see anything different. And if you then map that into the life of the carrier as they deploy carrier-grade NAT, and go back even to Patrick's comment about the financial per user cost of putting a carrier-grade NAT in there, you can in fact say that you can save money by deploying V6. You're not ever going to say you're removing V4. We're a long way off from that ever being a statement. However, in the case where you can reduce the amount of users and traffic flowing through your carrier-grade NAT, V6 gives you the cheapest path possible. And as many carriers have done this, whether they be in France or Romania, and now surprisingly very heavily in the United States, where there's some pretty lethargic carriers that seem to have taken this on in gusto, you can do the math very quickly and realize that they are saving money from the number of not users, but the number of transactions, the number of TCP connections that will have to be dealt with on their carrier-grade NAT. May not remove the carrier-grade NAT requirement, it will simply reduce it. And the final comment is that there is now enough major websites which importantly have revenue, advertising revenue or otherwise, associated with their deployment, who have gone full V6 as well as V4, that you can now relate that to any player that says, oh no, it's too much of an issue to go V6 because what if my users can't see my website? What if I lose money? Well, with the Googles and the Facebooks and the Bings and the list goes on, and I apologize for missing all the other major ones, we've got to the point now when there's a hell of a lot more revenue on their side at risk. And if I may say, at Cloudflare, we decided to do this in March, and we just turned on 1 million+ domains, and we're done. It's happy. And we see the spikes when we see those carriers doing their V6 trials. It's there. Sorry, that's it.
Thanks. And one last.
I just want to, first of all, I would like to apologize. I unfortunately need to go to the Swedish consulate here in Istanbul. Anyways, two of the largest cell phone providers in Sweden turned on IPv6 like 2 weeks ago, and we clearly see numbers that just turn it on. So cell phone providers, obviously, like not even the conservative ones in Sweden are like that, stepping back. So turn it on, start running it, easy.
Easy. Thanks, Patrick, and thanks for participating. And one last comment, and then I'm going to close this.
Thanks, Mark. Benedict Haddis, former National Cybercrime Unit in the UK, and about to be Patrick's colleague on the ICANN SSAC. So there's this, generally, this is great. There's this weird little idea that's crept in, though, that privacy and law enforcement are somehow heterogeneous ideas. Now, we operate in the EU, we operate according to the Human Rights Act, and actually, in every decision, we think about the privacy of the individual that we're looking at. Michael shaking his head, but it's true for law enforcement, it really is. Every day, and we worry about that stuff. And you're not allowed to turn your button on and disagree with me. So, the problem with CGNs, and I think Emily's touched on this, is the idea that we take away law enforcement's possibility and due process ability to selectively breach the privacy of an individual that it suspects of a crime in its sovereign state. And instead makes that law enforcement agent who is doing that legitimately go cap in hand to the only people that now have the ability that allows you to attribute a crime, and that's somebody who's operating a social network service or a webmail service at the application layer who know damn well who their users are. But they are then judge and jury and executioner of that person's privacy. And I will just give two very quick cases where that's happened, where one, I've had to argue that a threat to life that was imminent, a threat to to an ongoing court case where threats to life had been made, I had to argue the toss with an American company that actually it really was a threat to life. So I was a sworn law enforcement officer arguing that toss with a techie on a telephone line, effectively a sort of customer service agent. That's that for hours. That's not cool. And secondly, where a company decided that it would comply with one of my requests, but it would only give me information in what it deemed to be my jurisdiction. So if that target, again a legitimate target, had travelled, then they decided they just wouldn't give that to me, and they wouldn't tell me they weren't giving it to me. They just blanked that off the records.
That's exactly where I want to move next and let Bobby talk. But let me take this moment to thank Jeff Houston, who's participated late at night. Jeff, I want to say thanks and give you the chance to sign off here so that you can get to bed.
Most gracious of you, Mark. Thank you very much for that. And thanks indeed. Cheers.
Okay, thanks again, Jeff. And now I want to just give the floor to Bobby Flame. There are no slides here, but Bobby never needs them. And so I'll let him, really the last question, the last comment was a nice segue into many of the issues that Bobby faces on a day-to-day basis. And I think understanding the intersection of CGNs and law enforcement is a very, very important thing, not just for the technical community, many of whom are in the room, but also civil society and other people who are natural participants in the IGF. Thanks, Bobby.
Thanks. Just by way of introduction, I'm Bobby Flame, FBI, work in the Operational Technology Division in Washington, D.C. I got started with following or working on the carry-grade NAT issue, I would say about 3 or 4 years ago. Some operational issues came up. Certainly, it started on the mobile side, and then it went to the wired side. But two of the big indicators was that the CEO of ARIN came up to me. We have an ARIN government working group. He came up to me, he's like, you know, this is a real problem, carry-grade NATs, I hope you're aware of it. And I really wasn't aware to the extent of what was going on. And the second person that came up to me was Phil Roberts, who works at ISOC, and who was doing an internet draft on carry-grade NATs. And that was in, I believe it was 2011. I think that's when it was published. So with all that information, we created an ad hoc working group with industry, law enforcement and industry in Washington, D.C. And it was a U.S.-Canadian joint venture that we held with the National Cable Telecommunications Association. And one of the things we were trying to do is actually, I guess I was very naive, we were actually going to try to come up with a solution to carry-grade NATs and attribution, and how could we identify the end user and the subscriber in an easy way like we did before. And one of the mantras and the objective was simply to maintain current capability. One user, one identifier. In the past, it was one IP address. With carry-grade NATs, we didn't know what that was going to be. So we started with the ISPs in North America, which was Comcast, Sprint, Verizon, Cox, Bell Canada, Videotron, I believe, in Canada. So we were working with them. And then we realized the scope, since they were the ones deploying it, it kind of created a cascading effect where we had to get more information from other people, such as content providers. And that meant getting a source port. And when you had to get a source port, that meant you had to use Microsoft IS or Apache, and you had to make sure that their software is configured so that you can easily collect the source port. So that was something else. So our group over the 2.5 years expanded to include more of private industry, the vendors, the content providers, the Ciscos, the Alcatels, the Googles, the Yahoos, so on and so forth. And they kind of came in and out over the course of 9 meetings in 2 years. And we had the meetings in Washington, D.C. Europol actually had one of the last meetings last year at their headquarters in The Hague. For our efforts, there was some tangibles. One of the tangibles was an RFC 6302, which was to log the source port from content providers. And one of the other major accomplishments was Cable Labs, who works for the cable industry throughout the world, actually developed deterministic logging, which works for about 50 users or less, where you can randomly generate through an algorithm the port source or how they're allocated, and through that you're able to put the nexus and the identifiers together to identify that one specific end user. So we were able to do that. The other thing was we did put a request in to Microsoft through IIS to be able to easily collect the source port. That's something I'm not sure if they've done yet, but it is a request that they said they were going to try to look into. One of the biggest things was educating law enforcement, because in the United States we don't have data retention laws. So a lot of times when law enforcement asks for information via legal process, whether it be a subpoena, court order, and if it's not there, sometimes we assume that the time has lapsed or there was some other reason why that information isn't there. And a lot of times now it's because of a carry grade NAT. So we have to educate them that the carry grade NAT is out there and they need to ask for more specific information. They have to go down to almost the second for the IP address, the destination, and the source. And more importantly, they have to ask for that source port, because that is the critical identifier now with the IP address. So we were able to do that. The other thing that we're able to do is actually determine the extent of the problem. I actually published a survey within the FBI to see which cases have been affected by this. And the impact for us is that greater resources, manpower are being needed. The job of the law enforcement is to always try to overcome any obstacles to do the job. But that is getting more difficult with carry grade NATs. And carry grade NATs is just one thing that makes our life difficult. I would almost say it's low-hanging fruit, because you have proxies, you have a lot of other things out there that make our lives difficult. And we try not to overemphasize the carry grade NAT, but it is a problem. And it does impact the way we do things. It slows things down. And that's always bad, especially if you're talking about a kidnapping, a threat to life, anything like that. So that's where the problem is. It's also not only impacting the end user. Even after we have an end user, we have the pen registers, which is kind of recording of IP addresses back and forth. That has been upped, where we used to be able to get a court order. Now we need a full search warrant, which requires greater efforts of proof and factual requirements that weren't there before. I guess the solution, as we've all talked about, is the adoption of IPv6. So to put our money where our mouth is, when I was answering Michele's questions earlier, I'm the co-chair now of the United States government's IPv6 task force. So that's actually been a success, believe it or not, when we compare it to private industry, because there's two mandates for the US government. One is so that all of US government websites are accessible via IPv6. So if I'm an outside user and I'm trying to get at FBI.com, it's IPv6 and you can access it. So we're over 50% for that. So that's pretty good, especially compared to I guess, private industry rates of, I think it's hovering around 5 or 6%. The second mandate is that as an internal user, you're able to get to IPv6 websites. So if I'm on my desk at work at the FBI, I can actually go to Google and access their IPv6 website. So we're still working on that. The other thing, to go to Michele's point, we've also worked on procurement laws or procurement requirements, stating that whenever the U.S. government, and this goes across all the U.S. government, whenever they're procuring any devices, services, clouds, routers, telephones, anything, it's supposed to be IPv6. So we're trying to push that as well, kind of as a pincer movement in all different directions. But the bad news is the only real solution to the carry grade NAT really is legislation. We've already drafted it, and the legislation is technology neutral, which doesn't require an ISP or provider to log or to do anything specific, but only to merely identify that user at that time pursuant to legal process. That being said, it's a solution, but it's a long way off because of, unfortunately, the gridlock in not only Washington, but I'm afraid a lot of national capitals. So that isn't coming anytime soon. So the idea is to continuously work with our ISPs, with our providers, with lots of different people to see how we can overcome the current challenge. So I know we're running out of time, so I'll stop right there.
Thanks, Bobby. That's good stuff. Naturally, the law enforcement part of this dovetails with legal and public policy issues. And if I could get the next set of slides, that would be great. Perfect. And so to talk about legal and policy implications of carrier-grade NATs. Emily Taylor, who worked with us on the original survey that we did in the United Kingdom, is here. And so let me just pass the baton to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this workshop and doing the bit for gender balance here on the panel and in the room. Also, it is great to see the room so full at this late stage in the IGF and in the day. So I'm just going to try and get this to work. Okay.
Truly.
Oh, there you go. You did it. Thank you. So I'm going to very briefly discuss what the academic sources tell us about this development, and I'm not going to go too heavy on that. But also, one of the things that I was very interested in is thinking about the implication potentially on things like competition in the marketplace, whether it would be new entrants into the ISP market, applications and online service providers or developers, customers, and also the UK, which is where this study was based, versus international competitors. And then, as we've touched on, the ever tense balance between privacy, law enforcement, security, intellectual property, these areas which are difficult to balance. They aren't mutually exclusive, of course, but the difficulties that arise when you blur infrastructure and content. So when we started looking at this, we were quite surprised to find how little dedicated literature there is on carrier-grade NATs. It's a relatively new field of study, but it's quite interesting in a sort of gallows humour type of way, is that you kind of realise how many really fundamental and gritty policy issues it surfaces, whether it's looking at the way networks form and the fact that networks don't form in an evenly distributed way. Network theory predicts that people will, or nodes will powerfully attach, they'll preferentially attach to powerful hubs. And there's sort of an ever, there are difficult pulling apart and pushing together, that the network always threatens to pull apart. But so what does that mean for, how do carrier-grade NATs impact on this? What about the good old dumb network that we all grew up thinking the internet was? Mark, I think, covered this very well. But also network neutrality. Maria's question highlighted the different role of the internet service provider in an increasingly intelligent network. But also this concept of the internet as a public good, but the fact that at the same time it is all of the infrastructure is distributed and privately owned. What happens? Are we risking what's known in the literature rather poetically as a tragedy of the commons? So how could carrier-grade NATs affect competition? Well, at the time we were doing the study, there wasn't really widespread adoption of CGN in the UK, but we've heard from speakers today that this is growing apace. But in the UK, we have a big four ISPs. There are very high barriers to entry in any ISP market. We're fortunate enough to have very high internet penetration rates, and the latest indicators are that the people who are offline are really actually choosing to be offline and not, they don't really want to go online. But there's very high consumer dependence. Lots of people reporting addiction to their devices and to various social networks. I know that nobody in this room would suffer from that. But, that we love our devices, we love our internet, and so things that change it really will impact on the citizen. So, we've talked about the benefits in terms of prolonging the life of IPv4, and that is a real benefit. That's not just something to skate over. IPv4 is going to be with us for a long time as we make this transition. But the competition impact, the looking from the consumer's point of view, you think about your household. Your household probably isn't typical, but just think about if there are many of you living in the household, all with your own devices, all with session-hungry apps running at the same time. I mean, it's like the Matrix in our house. You know, we're just watching TV, all connected to the internet in various ways. You know, the gaming and all of this. What about new technologies? What about the Internet of Things that Vint Cerf said we all need and deserve? What happens if we are really behind the curve and don't adopt IPv6? Will we be left behind economically? So, and from business customers, the impact will be felt from, you know, a lot of businesses who do require a fixed IP address have one, so they pay for it. But increasingly, workforces are working from home. They might be working through a VPN. These guys are going to be affected too. But also, in what Ofcom called a sort of option swamp, it's very difficult for people to understand this stuff. And the risk is that people get upsold packages that they don't actually need in an effort to overcome some of the difficulties that they're suffering. I think that there are far-reaching effects that will be felt in competition, and in particular the role of the ISP, which is very, very interesting. There is massive potential for discrimination. If you are, you know, the permissionless innovation that we all chant to ourselves as one of the major benefits of the internet, well, you can pretty much forget about that in a carrier-grade NATS environment, because the owner of the network has the ability to discriminate against potentially competing services. Now, that would never happen in real life, right? Except we already know that Apple was taken to task for blocking Google Voice on an Apple iPhone on the basis that it replicated the phone's functionality. So people do these things, and this gives people, ISPs, a powerful opportunity to flex that muscle. Third-party applications break. ISPs' applications don't break. So there, again, is a potential for imbalance, a potential for market distortion. And when you think about one of the wonders of the internet, I think Patrick Falstrom put this very well, of comparing the rate of change in the old telephony environment, where it was up to the telco to give you something like *21# blah-de-blah, and the real explosion of innovation in applications that we've seen. Well, everybody starts as a new entrant, and they don't have to worry at the moment, or they didn't have to worry about how their brilliant new application would be carried on the internet. It would just be available. But if you're having to go and knock on the door of every internet service provider and ask them to punch a hole for you in their CGN, then they may or may not choose to respond. So that leaves innovators, and it leaves us as a society poorer for it. Consumers will have reduced choice, higher prices, and it should, I think it will, you know, Tim Wu's book, The Master Switch, which I think is brilliant, goes through every the life cycle of every new communications network, and predicts that after about 20 years of incredible openness, every single one closes and ossifies into oligopolies. And that's really what we're already seeing. And I think CGN is a wonderful tool in the hands of those who want to ossify market positions. Even if they don't want to, it will just have that effect. National competitiveness, if you are in a country or region where CGNs are widely deployed, you are going to be behind mass markets in Asia. Asian internet users are already over half the internet users in the world, and that's going to increase. When you look at penetration rates in Europe and North America, there isn't an awful lot more growth potential. The growth potential is all east and south. They're well ahead on IPv6 adoption, and we're going to be left behind. And if you're actually creating devices and applications for the internet, why would you try to do it? Wouldn't you be going to those growth markets? And of course, it does, you know, if you're going to have a two-tier system, then the smaller countries, the more behind on IPv6, are going to be on the losing side of that equation. Law enforcement, I think I don't really need to go into this because Bobby and Benedict have covered this brilliantly. I think the only thing to just emphasize is that IPv4 addresses, as there is market scarcity, Michaela, you mentioned the prices are going up, but also I'm aware that in certain RIRs, there are differing policies about recognizing transfers and almost an ideological type of reluctance to do that because it would recognize IP addresses as property. Well, if the authoritative database is not actually any more authoritative on where the IP address is operated from, then you're going to get an analogous situation to the good old domain names whois, which perhaps the less said the better. I mean, traditionally, IP address whois was always much more reliable than domain name whois. So another, terrible or brilliant, if you're interested in this sort of thing, impact of carrier-grade NATs is that it introduces a completely different network structure. You're back to the old telecommunications single point, single node broadcasting out, because that's what you have. And what you lose is the Paul Barron concept of the survivable network, the wonderful grid that was resilient to attack. And I've got a chart about the impact of attacks on this. Some standard security features don't work. Application designers have to redesign, and emergency services lack important information in the absence of geolocation information. Emphasizing the point about the single point, when you go back to a condensed and a centralized network, when you have attacks against a CGN infrastructure, there are 33% or so likely to have a devastating impact. And so you lose the benefits of that resilient web structure. Data retention costs we've talked about. Application and service providers, it's higher costs, higher impact, and the consumers are just lost in this mush of information they don't understand. But I do think taking the longer view, it has the potential to erode this permissionless environment and erode the separation between infrastructure and content, which is actually the benefit, the killer app that the internet brought us in the first place. It's very hard to quantify what the impact on innovation will be, but it will be. And of course, it doesn't help in this difficult and very tense situation we have, particularly at the moment, between balancing data retention, data protection, and human rights. So I think we do see the potential for a tiered internet and a level of service where the basic, it's the sort of, you're paying for what you should have for the initial thing. So that's a canter through the legal and policy implications. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Before we close this workshop, and we are sort of close to our time here, I just wanted to open the floor for comments from the whole workshop on issues surrounding law enforcement, since we have Bobby here, and also the public policy issues, and give the whole workshop a chance to either make comments or ask some questions.
I think there's...
Please.
Thank you, Mark. Again, Marco Welgewoon in RIPE NCC, the Regional Internet Registry for Europe. Yeah, Bobby, we've been bumping into each other for years now, and admiring the work that's being done in getting the RFC and getting the port logging. I fear it's too little, too late, in that, yes, you can address new deployments, but as Jeff earlier said, there's already a lot of that out there, and people with experience in industry can probably say yes to this, but it's always the hardest part is changing whatever is installed. It's the install base. It's not as much rolling out, but it's the software that's currently there that's not logging port numbers. And we're now starting to sound like a broken record, but what Alexi said, I think we also should realize that if we do encourage people to make those changes, if they deploy CGNs, is while you're changing your network, please also deploy IPv6, because that will be the ultimate solution. This is what we're now discussing is just patchwork. CGNs are supposed to be a temporary solution, and let's not lose sight on that, because ultimately getting rid of them should be the goal.
Agreed. Others? Sure, McKaylee, please.
I'll keep it brief. Bobby, for the first time ever, we actually agree on something. Though your motives, as we know, are the usual law enforcement motives, but at least we agree on something. You're no longer law enforcement. Stop backing them up.
I should close on that right there. Let me, before I, that's a momentous enough occasion that I should just end right there. But before I do, and before I thank the people who are on my panel, I want to do something that I think is not done enough here. And I want to thank the people in the back of the room. They're the ones who make remote participation possible, the streaming possible. The fact that we have a transcript is a gift to people who couldn't be here or couldn't participate on the day that the process takes place. It's not an exciting job in the back of the room. But it is something that is very important, not just to the IGF, but the internet community as a whole. And I hope you join me in thanking them for helping this process. Yes, please join me too in thanking my panelists, remotely, of course, Jeff Houston, then Bobby Flame, Emily Taylor, and Patrick Falstrom, who were gracious enough to agree to join to talk about this. And then finally, thanks to all of you for coming. Late on a Thursday, late in the IGF, a technical topic. You are not only brave, but gracious. Have a pleasant evening.